Goedemorgen dames en heren, beste partners, van harte welkom bij alweer het derde Carla's Automotive webinar. Speciaal voor u, onze partners, professionals in de verzekeringssector, leasesector en vlootsector. Zoals bij de twee voorgaande webinars zijn we uiteraard heel blij en dankbaar dat u met zoveel weer aanwezig zijn in dit webinar. Het onderwerp van vandaag belangt ons allen aan. En haast op een onopgemerkte manier gaat het een fundamentele verandering brengen in onze respectievelijke activiteiten. Het betreft namelijk een ingrijpende en onomkeerbare shift van automotive naar geïntegreerde mobiliteit en de impact op het ecosysteem.
Bonjour mesdames, messieurs, chers partenaires. Bienvenue à ce troisième webinaire de Carglass sur l'automotive. Un webinaire spécialement pour vous, nos partenaires, les professionnels de la gestion des flottes et de l'assurance automobile. Et comme pour les deux webinaires précédents, nous sommes très heureux de votre présence aujourd'hui en si grand nombre. Et surtout parce que le sujet d'aujourd'hui nous concerne tous. Il s'agit du passage radical et irréversible vers la mobilité intégrée et des mutations, des changements de l'écosystème qui l'accompagne.
We zijn bijzonder verheugd om vandaag een internationale autoriteit en expert betreft automotive en mobiliteit in ons midden te hebben. Het betreft namelijk Lukas Neckermann. Lukas Neckermann, een gerenommeerd gastspreker en ook auteur van een aantal bestsellers rond automotive en mobiliteit, waaronder bijvoorbeeld The Mobility Revolution, Smart Cities, Smart Mobility. In de komende 45 minuten gaat Lukas ons meenemen in een heel boeiend verhaal over de shift in mobiliteit en een nieuw ecosysteem wat in het leven is geroepen met nieuwe dynamiek, met nieuwe uitdagingen. En ook natuurlijk de impact van bijvoorbeeld COVID. Welke impact heeft COVID gehad op die nieuwe mobiliteit? Hoe ziet de toekomstige value chain eruit? En hoe belangrijk gaan data en connectiviteit zijn in die geïntegreerde mobiliteit?
Et comme Koen vient d'expliquer, nous sommes très heureux d'avoir pu inviter aujourd'hui une autorité internationale très connue. C'est Lukas Neckermann. Et donc, Monsieur Neckermann est un expert en mobilité. Il est aussi un conférencier très demandé partout dans le monde et il a écrit plusieurs best-sellers sur la mobilité, sur l'évolution de l'industrie automobile et l'impact dans le monde autour de nous. Et au cours des 45 minutes à suivre, je suis convaincue que M. Neckermann va nous raconter une histoire fascinante. Il va nous parler de l'évolution de la mobilité et la création d'un écosystème qui a de nouveaux besoins et de nouvelles attentes. Sans doute, il parlera aussi de l'impact du Covid aujourd'hui, ainsi de la nouvelle chaîne de valeur, et aussi de l'importance des data, des données et de la connectivité de la nouvelle mobilité.
Lukas Neckermann gaat zijn presentatie in het Engels geven, maar u kan alles volgen in uw eigen taal via de ondertiteling. Hou er wel rekening mee, we zijn live, dus dat er een klein beetje vertraging zal kunnen zitten op die vertaling. En op het einde van het webinar, traditiegetrouw, heeft u natuurlijk ook weer de mogelijkheid om vragen te stellen tijdens een korte Q&A. Maar u mag natuurlijk ook tijdens het webinar uw vragen via de chat indienen en dat kan natuurlijk in uw eigen taal.
Ok, donc Lukas Neckermann ferait sa présentation en anglais, mais vous pouvez suivre dans votre propre langue grâce aux sous-titres. Donc veuillez tenir compte que la traduction se fait en direct, donc ça veut dire qu'il y a peut-être un petit retard entre le discours de M. Neckermann et la traduction. À la fin du webinaire, comme d'habitude, il y aura aussi une session questions-réponses. Donc, lors de la présentation, vous pouvez poser vos questions via le chat dans votre propre langue. Donc, on fait la traduction pour M. Neckermann. Et si en cas où on n'a pas le temps de répondre à toutes les questions pendant ce webinaire, on revient vers vous par email avec la réponse sur votre question.
En als kers op de taart verloten we aan het einde van dit webinar ook nog 10 boeken van Lukas Neckermann. Dus blijf zeker kijken en luisteren. En u kan uw antwoord sturen via de chat om kans te maken natuurlijk op een van die boeken. So, Lukas, now it's up to you. We are all ears for your captivating story.
Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And whether you are a car manufacturer, in leasing, and in insurance, a dealer, a fleet manager on the maintenance side, or of course in the aftermarket, over the next 45 minutes, we'll show you how the world that you are in is changing, and it may actually be even beyond the world. It's actually an entire universe that is changing, because what we're talking about today is the ecosystem of mobility. We will talk about COVID and the impact that it has had on the acceleration of mobility. We'll talk about the value chain of mobility, because indeed it is a new industry that we are talking about. We'll deep dive into one area in particular, and that's data, and then we will conclude with some thoughts before, of course, as we've said now, taking some of your questions, and I do look forward to those questions as well. But let's start with the notion of mobility being its own industry. Now, over the last 120 years, we have gotten very accustomed to the idea of the automotive industry being at the center of the, well, call it solar system. Now, it wasn't always that way. Of course, we didn't always have petrol stations, fueling stations, because at the beginning, you might not remember, but at the beginning, you would have had to get petrol in glass bottles at the pharmacy. And that, of course, isn't the case. And the rise of the automotive industry is very closely linked to other industries that are related to that rise. But even beyond that, there are a number of other industries that have fueled the rise of automotive, but not been directly linked to automotive. And I'm talking about the financial services industry, of course, energy, primarily through oil and petrol. Real estate has, of course, accommodated the car. Just consider how much space is invested in every city for the car. It's about 30%. And that's roughly reflected in the homes that we buy and the space that we allocate to garages as well. There's the wider infrastructure, traffic lights, streets, highways, and then, of course, there's public transport, which exists in a certain tension with the private automobile, because the more private automobiles there are, the less demand there is for public transport. But when we talk about mobility being its own industry, it's also an integrative industry. Mobility, in fact, encapsulates so many of the elements of these other industries that it also transforms them. Consider, for example, in real estate, if we have drop-off and pickup zones for ride-hailing, or dedicated parking for electric vehicles or for car-sharing vehicles. Public transport is, of course, impacted because we now have a rise of on-demand buses. And we have a topic we'll talk about a lot more, which is mobility as a service. Now, the wider infrastructure world, of course, will have charging points all over the place, charging stations, which is also, of course, linked to a new actor in the energy space. That's the electric grid rather than the oil grid that we've had, and with it is linked some impact as well to our other industries, including finance, who of course needs to ensure the charging stations. The insurance for an electric vehicle is very, very different. But beyond that, of course, for dealerships and for leasing companies, we have the rise of different new business models around mobility, such as subscriptions and pay-as-you-go access to vehicles. So a big theme is, of course, access as opposed to ownership. And then finally, we have mobile payments, which we'll also touch upon very briefly in the course of this webinar. Now, we cannot talk about the rise of mobility without considering the impact of, well, frankly, the last 12, 14, 16 months. And indeed, COVID has accelerated in many ways mobility, but in any case, transformed it. Let's take a look at the immediate impact that we know from COVID. Of course, during the beginning of last year, we saw a significant drop in the sale of new passenger vehicles across Europe. But that, by and large, was recovered at the end of the year. And in fact, had it not been for a chip shortage, as many of us know, the production of automotive in Europe and across the world has been impacted through a lack of chips, which also, by the way, shows the importance of chips in the automotive process now. We might even have seen an over compensation for new car registrations across the EU. Now, we have not just this impact in Europe, but we have it across the world. Now, but that's only part of the picture, because whilst we may even consider leaning back and saying, well, what's the problem? What's the big change? Well, let's think about the types of vehicles that are being sold, because there's a significant difference that we have seen come about across the last 12 to 24 months. And that's the share of passenger cars that are electrified. It's even safe to say, and perhaps obvious to some in the audience, that electrified vehicles are now mass market. The share of passenger car sales in the EU is now roughly a third electrified, which is even more pronounced if we consider the intention to electrify by fleet managers. Now, this comes from research done by the Arval Mobility Observatory, who surveys 5,000 fleet managers or so across Europe every year in an observatory in a study. And the clear takeaway there is that whereas about a quarter of fleet managers have already implemented either a plug-in hybrid or fully electric vehicles, another third or so intend to do so over the next 3 years, meaning that clearly the electrification of fleets and individual vehicles across Europe is taking hold. Now, even that is only part of the picture, because post-COVID, how will indeed people get around? It's safe to say, and indeed we are seeing it from the numbers as well, that shared modes such as public transport in particular will have quite a difficult and bumpy road ahead of it over the next 2 to 3 years. In an average of 5 studies that we took a look at, people expected to use public transport between 57 and 77%, as much as they did pre-COVID. So that's a lot less revenue as well for public transport going forward. Other modes of shared transport, such as car sharing and ride hailing, well, those results varied. It really depended a lot on the city. Now, 2 big winners, if you can call it such, out of the transformation of the last 12 to 24 months is the car itself, the privately owned and used vehicle, where most people expressed the intention to use it more often in a post-pandemic world. But the other big winner, well, is anything on 2 wheels. In fact, e-bikes have become the best-selling bicycles across Europe. Those sales have increased dramatically over the course of the pandemic as people look for safe and secure ways to get around, in particular on what is called the last mile. Now, this is a distance that perhaps people previously might have taken a bus or a tube or a public transport of some sorts. The rise of scooters in particular across Europe has allowed people to get around in a safe way, in a secure, perhaps the socially distanced way. It also has kept economies moving post-pandemic, because the estimated economy of micromobility by 2030 is over 100 billion euros. And there's great potential, not just for electric scooters, but the continued rise of bicycles across Europe. And for those of you who are living in cities across Europe that see this type of picture every day, well, congratulations. For some of us, this is actually new. But for all of us, we will have seen that European cities have put down thousands and thousands of kilometers of new bicycle lanes during the course of the pandemic. Because again, it is a socially distanced and safe way to move around the cities. And through the rise of electric bikes, there is a new potential to attract a wider audience of users than before. So we have a mixed picture, as we say, across mobility. But even that doesn't tell the whole story. Because the big question is, how will we actually move around in a post-pandemic world? Will we even have the same need to move around in a post-pandemic world? Now, before COVID, around 5% of Europeans engaged in remote working. Now, this varied a little bit from country to country, and surely as well between rural areas and urban areas. But by and large, it was 5%. Now, if you consider many of us, certainly, not all of us, because certain industries and certain job titles and frankly, certain companies also are not as supportive of remote working, but by and large, around 25% of roles are, well, teleworkable, let's say, could be enabled for remote working in a post-pandemic world. And if you consider that, whereas before you might have been going to the office 5 days a week, and going forward, you might only be going to the office 3 days a week and remote working, that's already a 40% reduction in your own personal commuting time, but also commuting miles or kilometers. That's a pretty significant difference in the need for automobiles in the private space. So it changes the urbanization patterns that we see. It changes, of course, public transport usage. It changes infrastructure use as well, because maybe you decide that when you do go to the office, you're not going to go from 9 to 5, but you say, I will only come to the office for those meetings, for those brainstorming sessions, for those collaboration events. And if that's taking place at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, then you miss that peak time of travel. So we may actually see that infrastructure is used very differently, and that peak travel times are actually reduced. The other thing, of course, that we've seen is the rise in goods logistic. Who hasn't ordered things either from Amazon or other online shops, or even your groceries and your other restaurant deliveries? Most of us probably will have. And there's been of course, dramatic rise in those, even in some cases with deliveries by autonomous robots during the course of the pandemic. So with all of that in mind, it changes the way we use our cities. Now, there's been, in much of Europe, not all of Europe, but much of Europe, this idea that there's a primary city and then there are secondary cities. And most commerce, business takes place in the primary city or its suburbs. But what we will see is a change in urbanization patterns, which will give rise to second cities. So if we take France, for example, we will see whether it's Lyon or Toulouse or Lille become slightly more relevant, whereas coming to Paris every day is a bit less prevalent. And of course, in Belgium, the same could apply as well to Brussels. All right, so we will see not a decrease in urbanization rates, but a shift in urbanization away from primary cities and more towards secondary cities. So the route between cities is going to become more important. That has not been ignored by the real estate industries. In fact, a lot of them are already thinking about how do we transform our offices as people migrate from one city to another. Now, a number of companies, and we cite a few examples here, have already declared their intention to decrease the amount of office space. Allianz has said that they would enable some 40% of staff to work from home, which correlates to a 30% reduction in office space. Lloyds Bank in the UK has done similarly. And in fact, this translates not just into the office space requirement, but the requirement for parking. So there was a study by a pan-European parking industry body that said that 27% of employers would be reducing employee car parks post-pandemic because the need simply won't be there in the same way as before. And with all of that is, of course, a potential for cost savings due to remote work in a post-pandemic world. And depending on the industry, that could be anywhere between a quarter and a third of office space being saved. So quite a significant transformation in how we will use offices, how often we will go to offices or other places of work. So how do we make sense of it all? How do we make sense of it all? If we're traveling much, much less, then perhaps we will decide to use multiple modes of transport. We will say, okay, I don't need my car quite as much, but perhaps I will use a scooter or an e-bike, in particular for the last mile. Now, this means, and perhaps a little hint for those of you who are looking ahead to the quiz questions at the end. This means that the most powerful mobility tool that we have at our disposal is no longer the steering wheel. The most powerful mobility tool is, in fact, your smartphone. Because through your smartphone, you are able to make sense of all of the different modes of transport that are available to you. And this is what's generally called in the mobility industry MaaS, or mobility as a service. The ability to access multiple modes of transport via a single app on your phone. Or maybe it's multiple apps on your phone. But the bottom line is it makes sense of all of these different modes to you, and it also is real time. It gives you alerts if and when they are needed. It will tell you if and when there is traffic or other types of hindrances in your journey. So I've shown you so far how we are going from an automotive industry to a mobility industry, or a mobility as a service ecosystem. What does that actually mean for the industries that we operate in? And are these ideas actually compatible with some of these industries? Let's dig into the value chain. And let me start with a fundamental difference between the auto industry as we've known it and the mobility industry as I've shown it. First, the auto industry is focused primarily on manufacturing vehicles for ownership. That's what OEMs have primarily been doing for 120 years. Now, of course, we have supporting industries as I've mentioned, in particular around leasing and financing. But the mobility industry has a completely different focus that in some cases is not compatible with car manufacturers. Because the mobility industry is focused on operating fleets of shared vehicles in the most cost-effective way possible. So from a manufacturing and ownership business model to an operating shared vehicles business model means it's a quite substantial difference in also for some of you who your customers could be. Your customer may actually no longer be the end customer. Your customer could be, well, a fleet of shared, perhaps autonomous vehicles. We noticed a shift in the value chain. So we're all familiar with this very well-established value chain in automotive that goes from the first-tier suppliers to the car manufacturers, the dealerships, fleet management, and of course the aftermarket. Now the new value chain for mobility is quite different. And in fact, there are new actors, new players in this space. Of course, we still have suppliers, but some of those suppliers are also new to the industry. Who would have thought that Google might become a supplier to the industry, to vehicle manufacturers, or even a customer of vehicle manufacturers for that matter? Who would have thought that vehicle manufacturing itself could shift so much, also geographically, in particular, as we electrify? We're seeing a dramatic increase in number of brands and companies that are coming from China in particular, but a number of new brands emerging from the US, and a small handful of them in Europe. Now we have, as we said, new actors in this value chain. Systems and data. We'll deep dive on systems and data in just a few minutes, but let's just say that this is a very significant part of this new value chain. And then on the far right of this value chain, you see what I talked about earlier, mobility operators and mobility aggregators. These are the companies that make mobility accessible to the end user, so that when you pick up your smartphone and you tap on, I want a ride from A to B, they're the ones who are providing that ride for you, both on the smartphone and on the road. There's been significant investment into this value chain. But what's notable is if you take a look at venture investments over the last 10 years or so, where those investments have gone. They haven't, in fact, gone into the manufacturing side or even the fleet management side. No, they've primarily gone into the mobility operators and the mobility aggregators, around 100 billion or more. And then also on the tech side. That's where venture capital investment has gone. Now, has it generated value? Has it created new companies? Has it created new titans in the industry? Well, we could argue, yes, it has. If you consider the market cap, the market value of Uber today is greater than Daimler. It's in fact even greater than Stellantis and Ford put together. Then you can see that this industry has some new titans. Now we could certainly argue or maybe even have a debate around what is a justified valuation of a company in the mobility space. I can show you literally hundreds of other examples of industries at various parts of the value chain that contribute to mobility and have a much, much greater value today than they did 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. I'm thinking of companies like NVIDIA, who builds platforms for autonomous vehicles, or for that matter, Intel with Mobileye that also supports the rise of autonomous vehicles. These are companies that have grown significantly, and it means that the core of mobility and those heavyweights in the industry that influence the direction of the industry are no longer necessarily the car manufacturers that we've all grown up with. It's not necessarily BMW or Ford or Daimler or Volkswagen that, well, let's say, sets the tone and plays the music in the mobility industry. There are other players now that set the tone and influence the direction of travel. We have estimated around $1 trillion of new market value that is going to be unlocked by 2030. Now, there are some interesting developments around the vehicle manufacturing space, and I don't want to completely ignore those at all. But those aren't necessarily from manufacturers, again, that we know and have come to love over the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. There are new manufacturers, such as one here in the UK, where I'm based, called Arrival. And the key innovation that they have is not actually the vehicle that they build, but the way they build it. They have broken the paradigm of requiring 300, 400, or 500,000 vehicles per factory to have scale effects. They, in fact, intend to build over 30 so-called micro factories. Rather than bringing the vehicles to the end customer, they're going to bring the factory to the end customer. And one of their customers is UPS. And another of their customers is, in fact, Uber, who has ordered dedicated ride-hailing vehicles, specifically designed for the purpose of ride-hailing. So when I say your end customer may change and may look different some time from now, that's what I'm talking about, because Uber and their operators may at some point be, well, driving dedicated types of vehicles with fleets of 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. And it's not just a European phenomenon. We see this certainly in China as well, where Baidu and Didi will certainly have a relationship and order vehicles. We see it similarly in India, where we would expect someone like an Ola to order vehicles from a company like Tata. So again, it changes the dynamic of the industry when you have micro factories that are dedicated to the end user, and the end user in this case being a fleet of vehicles. Across the electrification space, now it feels like every single day that we open the newspapers, there's a new and a different electric vehicle company. And frankly, that may actually be true, because the borders, the barriers of entry for electric and electrified vehicles are much lower, in fact, than they are for the internal combustion engine vehicle. There are very, very much fewer parts necessary to build an electric vehicle. It's the reason why a company like Foxconn, who builds your iPhone, has for many years already expressed its intention to build electric vehicles. Because, well, if the car is going to be an iPhone on wheels, then why wouldn't the company that builds iPhones also build cars? Now, if we dig a little bit deeper into the production of electric vehicles, well, there are a number of different facets to it. It's the battery cell, which is very significant in this space, and having access, in fact, to the battery cell is a key differentiator at this point. There's the battery pack, software and assembling, and maybe even sales and service. Those are areas where almost every electric vehicle manufacturer is clear. They will need that to differentiate themselves in this space. Now, some, such as Tesla, run their own networks of charging points. Some even go so far as to produce their own electricity. A key new business model going forward in a certainly electrified world that we see is the ability and the business model around battery recycling. And we can see here just a list of a few of the startups, a few of the companies that we know and might have heard of, and where they stand on this electric vehicle production chain. But just to be clear, not all new electric vehicle manufacturers bring the same IP. They don't bring the same intellectual property and quality to the table. There are some that frankly are entering the space with very little to their name, but a design. And maybe or maybe not, that will be relevant. We like to think that it will be. So in the, well, let's say infamous words of one of the greatest investors of the last 50 years, we will see who will be left over in the next few years as we get through a wave of consolidation in the electric vehicle production space. Warren Buffett says, it's only when the tide goes out that you learn who has been swimming naked. And there are some manufacturers who have built up fantastic intellectual property, production capacity, and vehicle choice, and some who haven't. But that doesn't change the fact that we are moving into an electrified world, into a world of mobility and mobility as a service. And those who have been able to adapt themselves, whether they're automakers or even dealers and fleet management companies, only those who have been able to adapt to this new world, well, they will survive when the tide goes out. Let's dig a little bit deeper in one area in particular, because I think it impacts many of you that are watching today. And that's the space of systems and data, maybe even a little bit around fleet management. Now, it almost goes without saying that all new vehicles will be 100% connected in the next few years. Now, according to one study, the share of new cars connected in the UK will be around 100% by 2025. But the reality is, in fact, that the European Union has enacted the EU General Safety Regulation, and with it comes a series of features, a series of primarily safety features for the vehicles, but features that will create piles of data. Because in order to have an event data recorder, in order to process enough information to enact emergency braking in the vehicle, in order to have intelligent speed assist and lane keeping assist, your new vehicle has a whole series of radar, LiDAR, and camera technologies built into it. These are all features that will become mandatory on new vehicles in Europe. And with all of those new features come data sources. As I mentioned, cameras, sensors, and frankly, also an interaction with the cloud. Cloud data that the vehicle will be sending to the cloud, but also cloud data that is being sent to the vehicle. Now, there are a lot of companies, a lot of different users of these data packs. And in fact, if you think about, well, yes, of course, insurance, but fleet management, anyone who runs a fleet and has telematics built into it is already familiar with this concept. But you also have those companies that transmit the data, the broadband providers, the, well, cell phone providers, 4G and 5G technology enablers. Those of you who are dealers will have access to data. It might just be that public authorities have access to data, the after sales, and of course the user might also want to have access to data. Now, whether or not everyone uses this data, that's a different question. But there will be lots and lots of parties who have access to data, which is why I say that data is like water. Everyone who touches it gets a little bit wet. There's not one single owner of data because everybody on this chain and everyone who touches the data will have access to the user data and the vehicle data. Let me let me share one example. Now, the insurance industry, and I'll be transparent here, I spent 11 years in the insurance industry myself, including on the car space. So, well, it hasn't always had the best reputation around innovation and transparency on pricing in particular. Sometimes there have been challenges around customer service, lots of back and forth for simple changes to the contract. And maybe there have been mismatches in pricing where the consumer pricing didn't necessarily match the risk, or where there's a difference, of course, between the consumer price and the risk-based price. And finally, of course, on the claim side as well, the claim status in an ideal case would be constantly updated. Now, if you have all of the data, the insurance industry can very much consider reinventing itself, and it may need to. Not just because insuring an electric vehicle means you're insuring a battery. It may also mean that you're insuring a charging point. Not just because the rise of autonomous vehicles mean that there will be a lower frequency of claims, but perhaps a higher single claim cost. And also that the autonomous vehicle will mean that it's a decrease in retail insurance and an increase, presumably, in product liability insurance, as these fleets of autonomous vehicles are insured at the operator level rather than at the user level. And not just because the ownership of private vehicles will decrease, in particular, younger generations who have, well, brought a lot of premium, but also a lot of claims in previously, who are choosing simply not to have a driving license and instead are using the most powerful mode of mobility, which we remember is, of course, no longer the steering wheel, but the smartphone. But that does create opportunities for the insurance industry because there is the notion of pay as you go. Now, again, telematics fleets already are familiar with this concept. But shared mobility users, whether it's ride hailing or ride pooling or car sharing, creates a new opportunity and a new business model and business design for some insurers who are awake to this challenge. Some insurers may actually decide that managing these streams of data between all of those who have access to the data becomes part of their own business model. And of course, autonomous, as I said, creates a shift from retail to more public product liability types of insurance. Now, what about the dealership? It could very well be that the dealer becomes this intermediary for these pools of data. You have the data, you have access to the data. In fact, the customer of a fully connected car signs the contract that provides the dealership, by and large, with a certain amount of data. So there is a potential for the dealer, in fact, to understand how users use their vehicles. And they may actually decide, well, because we know how the user is using the data, we can actually go beyond selling sheet metal. We can go into selling mobility. All right? And the clue is in the name. If you are a dealer, you deal. You sell. And maybe what you're selling is, at the end of the day, as I said, access to mobility and kilometers, as opposed to floor mats and rims. You may also choose to go down the route of fleet management for shared mobility. These are options that are available to dealers who I've always considered one of the most clever parts of the entire automotive value chain, because they're the ones with a direct access to the end user. Now, data also sits at the core of mobility management, and I'm being explicit here because it's no longer about fleet management. It's about mobility management. It's about managing the transportation choices that your staff make. Whether it's a rental car, whether it's a lease car, but also Maybe it's via car sharing or micromobility or e-bike. And all of those new modes of transport mean that the fleet manager has new roles and has become effectively a manager of mobility. Let me come to a short conclusion, and then I look forward to taking your questions on what we've shared today. First, mobility is a new industry. It represents a new world of opportunities to all of the industries that are represented here today. In the aftermarket, well, we did talk about on-demand mobility, which means that people are choosing mobility not at their car, but where they are at. And not so much which car am I going to choose, but how do I get from A to B, which mode of mobility. But insofar as they do have a car, they say, well, listen, come to me. I'm not going to come to you, come to me. Go to the customers and not the opposite. There's a real potential to take leadership here. In a world where we are getting everything delivered, from a pen to a computer to a car, well, service is actually also being delivered. On the insurance side, as I mentioned, there will be new pay-as-you-go business models around shared mobility, subscriptions, and then, of course, the shift from retail to product liability. Dealerships, well, I encourage many of you to stop selling sheet metal. Well, maybe not stop, but in addition to selling sheet metal, also start selling kilometers. Get involved in the mobility value chain. And then finally, data itself is a business. Selling data, whether we as consumers and whether we as objects of data, producers of data, like it or not, data itself is a business. And with it come a lot of opportunities. So I encourage exploration in that space to create the new universe that we will live in a world of mobility. Thank you for your attention so far, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for this fascinating story. We are surely and gradually waking up in a completely new world, and I think that our spectators, they are quite sure that we have to look at our business models because everything is changing drastically. And COVID-19 obviously was also a kind of acceleration effect in some tendencies who were already present before. So our viewers enjoyed it. If you look at the questions we got, so I suggest we start, Caroline, with the first question.
We got a lot of questions, so I will pick out one from the list. And it's a short question, but I think the answer will be a little bit longer. The question is, will GDPR slow down the connectivity? It's a short one, but please give us your thought around this one. How do you see it?
The simple answer is no. It will not slow things down. And in fact, it has the potential to accelerate things because what GDPR does is it creates a clarity. It doesn't prevent the use of data at all. It just means that the user has to opt in to the use of data. But as we well know, people are opting in to using Facebook, to using LinkedIn, to using Twitter. And all of those, arguably, in some way, shape, or form, are GDPR compliant as soon as you say, I consent. And in that way, if you sign a contract for a new vehicle, whether as an owner or a user, you already accept that the data is going to be used in potentially business model relevant ways. So I don't think GDPR will slow it. I do think that it creates very, very important transparency and rules on the use of data. And I applaud, of course, the fact that we in Europe do have a leadership role in that transparency through GDPR. And I, to be frank, also wish that others would follow in a strong GDPR compliant environment.
Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps another question related to the data and the connectivity. It's not about privacy, but it's more about cybercrime and hacking of data. Because the last months we see a lot of hacking going on in the world. What about that? What's the risk about hacking the data that will be present in all the future
I truly
technology?
wish we could prevent it, but the reality is that frankly we can't. The best we can do is stay a step ahead of it, and that is a battle or a race that we're going to be engaged in for probably the rest of our the rest of our online existence. I hate to make this comparison, but it's a little bit like creating vaccines for a virus. Every time there's a new cyber attack, we have to create a vaccine for it. And that vaccine will be by way of auto updates. Why, frankly, it's also very important for cars to be connected on a regular basis, because just as your laptop updates itself, your car will update itself on a regular basis in order to address the, yes, indeed, growing risk of cybercrime.
Perhaps also a quite short question, but an important one, I think, is how do you see the role of the traditional insurer by the shift of, let's say, the driver responsibility towards more product responsibility if you are moving on to the automotive vehicles, autonomous vehicles, excuse me?
There are, of course, a handful of insurers across Europe in particular that have very close relationships with OEMs or with those who market and sell vehicles. And those insurers in particular have a distinct data advantage, right? They know who the vehicles are being sold to, in particular, how they're being used, and they involve the entire value chain. In other words, the dealership who sells that insurer's product to the end users, there's a stream of information between the insurer, the dealership, and the end user. So I do think there's a certain advantage to those insurers on the retail side, but on the let's call it corporate and specialty side, we have the advantage, we have the potential for product liability. We have a number of manufacturers who've said, if we are in a fully autonomous world, then we will take on the liability if our vehicle creates or is involved in an accident. And that is a significant statement. And I'm sure the OEMs who have made that commitment will not have done so without getting, at the very least, reinsurance, if not primary commercial insurance, to make that claim.
Okay, thank you. You have one?
I'm looking, there's a lot of questions which have come in.
Anyway, we will send all the questions to you, Lucas,
Yes.
so then we can you can answer them afterwards, and we send out the answers to our audience, because we have obviously to respect the time.
The timing also.
So, yeah, absolutely. So thanks a lot for answering the current questions, but we will send them over. En we hadden jullie natuurlijk ook beloofd dat we op het einde nog 10 boeken zouden gaan verloten van Lukas Neckermann. En de vraag waarop jullie moeten antwoorden is: wat is de meest krachtige mobility tool? Zoals jullie wellicht net gehoord hebben, zoek het antwoord niet te ver. Wat is de meest krachtige mobility tool?
Donc, comme promis à l'intro, donc, nous avons 10 livres de Lukas Neckermann, donc, à distribuer parmi 10 personnes heureuses qui ont la réponse correcte sur la question suivante. Et vous pouvez donner votre réponse dans le chat. Donc, la question, c'est quel est l'outil de mobilité le plus puissant? Et ne cherchez pas trop loin parce qu'on l'utilise tous les jours. Et donc, on va voir les réponses et on va tirer à sort 10 personnes qui vont recevoir un livre bientôt.
Lukas Neckermann, thanks again for this really fascinating story you brought today. It was really exciting to be part of it. Het webinar zit er weer op. Noteer in elk geval al 7 oktober in jullie agenda's voor ons volgende Carla's Automotive webinar. Bedankt voor het kijken en het luisteren. En wij hopen in ieder geval dat u evenveel heeft opgestoken als wij. En heel graag tot het volgende webinar.
Donc voilà, le webinaire d'aujourd'hui est terminé. Donc veuillez déjà noter le 7 octobre dans vos agendas parce que ce sera la date de notre prochain webinaire, donc de quart classe. Et pour maintenant, il me reste de la part de Koen et moi de vous remercier pour votre présence aujourd'hui et j'espère que vous l'avez apprécié autant que Koen et moi. À bientôt. Bonne journée.
Tot ziens.
Salut.